In this video we will explore how the Black Death affected Europe. If you enjoy these videos, please feel free to leave a like and/or subscribe. But for now, sit back, relax, and enjoy. Close your eyes. Let your body sink a little deeper into where you rest. Take a slow breath in and let it go. We are going somewhere together tonight. Somewhere distant. Somewhere that will ask nothing of you but your quiet attention. You don't need to remember any of this. You don't need to hold on to anything. Just listen and let the story carry you. We are going back, far back, to a world that no longer exists and yet, in so many ways, is the very reason our world does. The year is somewhere around 1340. Imagine, if you will, the continent of Europe as it was then. Not the Europe of highways and electric light, not the Europe of borders drawn on paper and enforced by machines, but an older Europe, a quieter one, a Europe of mud and smoke and bells. The countryside rolls out in every direction, fields of wheat and rye, stitched together by hedgerows and dot paths that have been walked so many times they have sunk into the earth like veins. In the early morning, before the sun has fully climbed, the land is pale and silver with mist. Farmers are already moving through it. They rise before the light because the light is precious and the work is endless. Villages cluster together the way frightened animals do, not for any grand reason, but because alone, in that vast and unpredictable world, a person did not last long. Community was survival. The church at the center of every village was not merely a place of worship. It was a calendar, a courthouse, a hospital, a gathering point in times of flood or fire or fear. Life was hard. It is important to understand this, not to romanticize the difficulty, but because it matters for what comes later. The average person living in 14th century Europe would not have recognized the word peasant as an insult. It simply described what they were, someone who worked the land. And the land was everything. The land was the source of food, of worth, of identity. You knew who you were because you knew which field you had plowed since childhood, which lord owned the land above you, which saint watched over the parish where your grandparents were buried. Life expectancy, by our modern reckoning, was perhaps 35 to 40 years, though those numbers are softened by the terrible weight of infant mortality. If a child survived their first 5 years, they might well live into their 50s or even 60s. But many did not survive. Sickness was constant. Winter was cruel. Hunger was not unusual. And yet this is the part that sometimes surprises people. There was joy. There was music at festivals. There was ale at the tavern. There were saints' days when no one worked, and the village would come alive with dancing and color and laughter. Children played in streams. Old men argued over chess pieces carved from bone. Women sang while they worked the looms. It was not a small life. It was a full one, just fragile in ways we have mostly forgotten. Now let your breath slow a little more. Feel the weight of your limbs. You are safe. You are still. Let the world outside this room grow very far away. To understand the Black Death, we must also understand the world of trade, because it was trade, that ancient human impulse to exchange and connect, that would carry the plague from one corner of the known world to another. By the middle of the 14th century, Europe was deeply connected to the wider world in ways that its people barely understood. Merchants from the Italian city-states, from Venice, from Genoa, from Florence had built extraordinary networks of commerce that stretched east through Constantinople, through the kingdoms of the Middle East, and all the way to the vast Mongol Empire that sprawled across Central Asia. The Silk Road was not one road. It was a web of roads, a lattice of routes and relay stations and caravanserais, those great inn-like structures where travelers could rest their camels and sleep under shed roofs. Along these routes moved silk from China, spices from the Spice Islands, glassware, furs, salt, copper, and gold. And along these routes moved something else, invisible and patient, waiting in the bodies of fleas, nesting in the fur of rats. But we will come to that. For now, rest in this picture: the world connected, trade bringing wealth, wealth building cities, cities filling with people, crowded and lively and utterly unprepared. The great cities of Europe in 1340 were extraordinary places. London had perhaps 80,000 people packed inside its ancient Roman walls and spilling out beyond them into suburbs of tanners and dyers and butchers, whose work filled the air with smoke and smell. Paris was larger still, perhaps 200,000 souls, the largest city north of the Alps, a churning, noisy, magnificent place of learning and commerce and poverty existing side by side. Florence, in northern Italy, was perhaps the wealthiest city in Europe, its banks financing kings and popes, its merchants draped in the finest cloth their own looms could produce. Venice floated on its lagoon like a dream made solid, a city of canals and marble and the perpetual sound of water, its trading galleys moving through the Mediterranean like fingers reaching into every corner of the known world. These cities had no sewers in the modern sense. Waste ran in channels down the middle of streets, or was simply thrown from windows with a shouted warning. Drinking water came from wells and rivers that received the runoff of everything animal and human alike. The smell of a medieval city, on a warm day, is something our noses have entirely lost the capacity to imagine. And yet people lived and thrived and built cathedrals that still stand. The church was everywhere. Not the church as we might understand it today, a place you might visit once a week, but a church that was woven through every moment of every day. The ringing of bells marked the canonical hours: matins at midnight, lauds before dawn, prime at sunrise, terce, sext, none through the working day, vespers at dusk, compline before sleep. Life moved to a rhythm that was simultaneously the rhythm of prayer and the rhythm of work. Priests were the educated men of their communities. Monks preserved ancient texts, copied manuscripts, ran hospitals, brewed medicine. The church was not merely spiritual, it was the infrastructure of civilization. The rain softens further. A single owl calls, once, and then silence settles back. Let your thoughts drift, if they want to. There's no need to hold the details. The story will hold them for you. Just rest here, in this old world, before everything changed. And now gently, carefully we turn our attention eastward. Far to the east, in the grasslands and trade routes of Central Asia, something had already begun. Something that the people of Europe knew nothing about, could not have known anything about, because the world they understood ended at the horizon of their own experience. It is believed, and the evidence points strongly in this direction, that the plague originated somewhere in the region of Central Asia, perhaps in what is now Kyrgyzstan or the areas surrounding the Caspian Sea. Recent archaeological work has even found burial sites from the late 1330s that show unusual clustering of deaths, with inscriptions that some scholars believe reference pestilence. The pathogen responsible was Yersinia pestis, a bacterium. Its natural reservoir was, and still is, certain populations of rodents, ground squirrels, marmots, and rats among them. In the wild, it circulates quietly, carried by fleas from host to host, its existence barely noticed. Occasionally, in those wild populations, there are die-off sudden, strange collapses of the local rodent population that leave old-timers in the region uneasy. When those rodent populations collapse, the fleas that carried the bacterium are left without a host. And hungry fleas, without a host, will find one. They will find rats. And rats, across the centuries and civilizations of the human world, have always lived close to people. In the grain stores, in the walls of houses, on the ships that cross the seas. The flea bites the rat. The flea bites the person. The bacterium enters the bloodstream and begins its work. The trade routes carried it westward. It moved along the arteries of commerce, along the roads of the Mongol Empire, through the Crimea, through the Black Sea ports. In 1346, there are records of a catastrophic outbreak at Kaffa, a Genos trading post on the Crimean Peninsula. The city was under siege by Mongol forces, and it is said by the chronicler Gabriel de Mussis, writing not long after, that the Mongol army, ravaged by plague themselves, catapulted the bodies of their dead over the city walls. Whether this act of terrible ingenuity actually spread the disease in that specific case, historians debate. The rats on the ships were likely sufficient on their own. But the story persists because it captures something true. In those final years of the 1340s, the plague was closing in on Europe from every direction. The Genos merchants, fleeing Kaffa, sailed west. They carried their cargo and their flea-ridden rats and their own already infected bodies into the ports of Constantinople, of Sicily, of Messina. And in the autumn of 1347, the Black Death arrived in Europe. But tonight, we will not rush there yet. Tonight, in this first chapter, we stay for just a little longer in the world as it was whole, imperfect, alive before the storm arrived. Because to understand what was lost, you have to know what existed. The farmer in his field, his hands deep in the cold autumn earth. The monk in his scriptorium, bending close to the vellum by candlelight. The merchant on the road between Florence and Venice, his mule loaded with cloth, his mind already calculating the price he'll fetch in the next town. The child in the village, asleep in a bed shared with 3 siblings, unaware of any world beyond the church tower and the river and the smell of her mother's bread. These are the people whose world was about to change beyond all recognition. Their story is the one we're telling. The autumn of 1347. The Mediterranean, as it has always been, was alive with sails. The sea had been the highway of the ancient world long before roads were cut through forests, long before bridges crossed rivers. The Phoenicians sailed it. The Greeks built their empire along its shores. Rome had called it Mare Nostrum, our sea, and the civilizations that came after Rome never forgot that lesson. Control the sea, and you control the movement of everything. In 1347, the sea was full of Genos ships. Genoa was one of the great maritime powers of the age, a city on the northern coast of Italy whose wealth and influence depended entirely on trade. Its merchants had pushed further east than almost any others, establishing colonies and trading posts along the Black Sea coast, in Constantinople, in the Crimea. They were, by any measure, the connective tissue of European commerce. And it was from their colony at Kaffa that besieged the port on the Crimean Peninsula we touched on, before that a fleet of ships now sailed westward. They had been through something terrible. The men who boarded those ships in Kaffa had watched their companions die. They had seen the swellings grotesque, painful lumps appearing in the groin, in the armpit, at the neck. They had heard the delirious cries of the sick in the night. Some of them, already carrying the infection without knowing it yet, climbed the rope ladders and took their places at the oars. The rats came with them, as rats always did, hidden in the cargo hold, nesting in the grain sacks, moving through the darkness of the ship's belly. And on the rats, the fleas. The fleet sailed through the Bosphorus. It moved south and west, past Constantinople where, it is recorded, the plague had already arrived and was already killing, and out into the open waters of the Aegean. It rounded the toe of Italy, moved through the narrow straits, and in October of 1347, Several Genoese galleys arrived in the harbor of Messina, on the northeastern tip of Sicily. The water's sounds soften. A harbor bell. Distant voices. Let your breathing slow. In through the nose, and out. Feel the stillness of where you are. You are not on that harbor. You are warm and safe and very far from 1347. Just listen. The people of Messina came to the docks, as people always did when ships arrived. Ships meant news from distant places. Ships meant goods, cloth, and spices, and the small luxuries that made the hardness of life a little softer. Sailors meant stories. But something was wrong. The dock workers noticed it first. The sailors who came ashore moved strangely, some barely able to walk, leaning on one another, their skin darkened with strange discolorations, their eyes glassy with fever. Some did not come ashore at all. Some were already dead at their posts. The Sicilian authorities, to their credit, acted quickly. The port officials of Messina ordered the Genoese fleet out of the harbor, a decision that must have required considerable nerve, given the power of the Genoese trading houses. The ships were sent away. But it was already too late. Whatever had come off those ships in the hours between arrival and expulsion, the sailors who had staggered ashore, the rats who had slipped down the mooring ropes, the fleas that had leapt from fur to cloth to skin, it was already loose in Messina. And within days, people in the city began to fall ill. The Sicilian chronicler Michel da Piazza, writing shortly afterwards, described what the townspeople saw. Strangers arriving with a sickness in their blood, swellings at the groin and armpit growing to the size of a fist, the sick vomiting blood, unable to eat, burning with fever, unable to find any position comfortable enough to rest. He wrote that the stench from the sick was so overwhelming that people could barely approach them, that those who looked upon the dying or spoke with them seemed to catch the sickness themselves. The city erupted into panic. People fled to the countryside, to nearby towns, to relatives in other villages. And they carried the flea, and the rat, and the invisible passenger in their blood, with them wherever they went. This is the cruel mathematics of a contagion, the very human instinct that should save you to run, to flee, to put distance between yourself and the danger becomes the mechanism of the disease's spread. Every cart that rolled out of Messina in those weeks of panic carried the plague a little further into Sicily. Every ship that left the harbor, and there were many, the authorities unable to stop them all carried it to the next port along the coast. By November of 1347, the plague was in Catania. By December, it had reached Palermo on the western tip of the island, and by the time the new year turned, the ships had carried it across the narrow strait to the mainland of Italy itself. Italy in 1348. If you were to look down at the Italian peninsula from some impossible height, as if floating above it like a dream, you would see a land of extraordinary beauty and complexity. The north is bordered by the great wall of the Alps, their peaks still white with winter. Below them, the wide flat plain of the Po Valley stretches east to west, the most fertile farmland in the peninsula, threaded with rivers, dotted with cities. Florence, Milan, Venice, Bologna, Padua. These were not merely cities. They were civilizations unto themselves, each with its own culture, its own government, its own sense of superiority over all the others. The Italian city-states of the 14th century were brilliant and brutal and magnificent, full of art and banking and political intrigue. Florence, in particular, was a city at the height of its powers. The great banking families, the Bardi, the Peruzzi, the Acciaiuoli, had built financial networks that stretched across all of Europe. The wool trade had made the city rich beyond almost any other place in the world. And Florence was also, at this very moment, home to a young man named Giovanni Boccaccio. Boccaccio was 35 years old in 1348. He was a writer, clever, observant, deeply human in his sympathies. And he was in Florence when the plague arrived, and he survived it, and he wrote about what he saw with a vividness and precision that has never been surpassed. His account, which opens the Decameron, a great collection of stories he wrote in the aftermath, is one of the most important documents we have of the Black Death. Not because it is the most scientific or the most politically detailed, but because it is the most human. He wrote about the symptoms, the swellings he called gavoculi, appearing first in the groin and armpit, swelling to the size of a common apple or egg, spreading from there across the body, dark blotches appearing on the skin. He wrote about the speed of death, some people dying within 3 days, others within hours of first falling sick, some going to bed apparently healthy and never waking. He wrote about the collapse of ordinary human kindness under the pressure of terror. Neighbors refused to help neighbors. Families abandoned the sick. The old systems of care, the church visiting the dying, the neighbors sitting with the bereaved, the rituals of washing and dressing the dead, all of it began to dissolve, because to be near the dying was to risk becoming one of them. Let that settle. You don't need to hold the weight of it. You are here. You are breathing. You are far from all of it. Let your body rest a little more heavily where it lies. The plague moved through Italy with a speed and thoroughness that stunned everyone who witnessed it. It did not move evenly. It fled in one city, seemed to spare another, then doubled back. But the general direction was unstoppable. Pisa fell in January 1348. Genoa, the very city whose ships had carried the plague westward from the Black Sea, fell in the same month. The city's people burning the clothes of the dead in the streets, and yet finding no way to stop what had already begun among them. Florence fell in the spring. Venice fell. Milan fell. And from the ports and trading cities of northern Italy, the plague moved outward along every road and sea lane that connected Italy to the rest of Europe. Ships from Genoa and Pisa carried it to the ports of southern France to Marseille, which fell in January 1348, and from Marseille westward along the coast toward Spain, and northward up the Rhone Valley toward the interior of the continent. By the spring of 1348, the Black Death was no longer a catastrophe contained within a single region. It was becoming a continental disaster. There is a detail that stays with me from the records of this period. In the city of Venice, the authorities and the Venetians were among the most organized and administratively capable people of the medieval world, who tried very hard to understand what was happening and to respond to it. They appointed a commission of 3 noblemen to oversee the city's response to the plague. They ordered the dead to be buried in deep graves, away from the city's churches. They tried to isolate the sick, and they kept records. The death registers of Venice from 1348 are extraordinary documents. Names, dates, parishes. Page after page of the ordinary dead: the baker, the boatman, the notary's wife, the child of a cloth merchant. And then, as spring arrives in those pages, the names begin to come faster. The entries grow shorter, the handwriting more horrid. Whole families appear in the same week. And then the handwriting changes because the man who had been keeping the register had himself died, and someone else had taken up the pen, and then that person's handwriting vanishes too. The registers keep being kept because the city kept needing them. But you can feel the change. We left Italy burning. Not literally, though there were fires, pyres of the dead burning in the fields outside Florence, the smoke visible for miles. But burning in the sense that a fire burns through dry grass, fast, indiscriminate, leaving behind a landscape that no longer resembles itself. By the middle of 1348, the plague had consumed much of the Italian peninsula. The great cities Florence, Venice, Genoa, Pisa had each lost somewhere between a third and half of their populations. In some smaller towns and villages, the death toll was even higher. There were places where almost no one survived. And the roads leading north and west out of Italy were busy. Merchants who had not yet fallen ill, or who did not yet know they were carrying the infection, continued to travel. They had debts to collect and contracts to honor and goods to deliver. The world of commerce does not stop easily. It has its own momentum, its own logic, its own insistence on continuing. And so they traveled, and the plague traveled with them. Follow the Rhone. The Rhone is one of the great rivers of Europe. It rises in the Swiss Alps and flows south and west through the heart of what is now France, broad and powerful, its valley rich with vineyards and market towns. In the 14th century, the Rhone Valley was one of the busiest corridors in Europe. Goods moved up it from the Mediterranean ports. Pilgrims and merchants moved down it toward Italy and Spain. And at the point where the Rhone meets the sea at the port of Marseille, on the southern coast of France, the plague arrived by ship from Genoa in January of 1348. Marseille fell quickly. It was a port city, dense with sailors and traders and the constant movement of people and goods, exactly the kind of place where disease spread by fleas and rats would find ideal conditions. Within weeks of the first cases, the city was in crisis. From Marseille, the plague moved in several directions at once. It followed the coast westward toward Montpellier, the great center of medieval medical learning, home to one of the oldest universities in Europe, full of the most educated physicians of the age. It would matter, later, what those physicians thought about what they were seeing. It moved eastward along the coast toward Toulon, and it moved northward, up the Rhone, toward the interior of France. Breathe slowly, in and out. Feel the weight of your head against the pillow. Feel the warmth of the blankets or the bed beneath you. You are very comfortable. You are very safe. The story moves around you like water around a stone. Avignon. In 1348, the city of Avignon was not simply a city. It was the seat of the papacy, the home of the Pope himself, and the entire administrative machinery of the Catholic Church. For reasons of complex politics that had pulled the papacy out of Rome decades earlier, the popes had been living in Avignon since 1309, and the city had grown accordingly, enormous, wealthy, packed with cardinals and bishops and lawyers and petitioners from every corner of the Christian world. When the plague reached Avignon in the spring of 1348, it hit the most important city in the Christian world. Pope Clement VI, a practical, intelligent man, rather more rational than many of his contemporaries, was advised by his personal physician, Guy de Chauliac, one of the most accomplished doctors of the age. Guy de Chauliac kept careful notes. He caught the plague himself, the pneumonic form, which attacked the lungs and survived, which gave him a clinical understanding of the disease that very few people possessed. He wrote that the plague in Avignon came in two waves. The first was the bubonic form, the swellings, the fever, the dark blotches, and it lasted through the spring. The second wave, which came in the summer, was the pneumonic form, people coughing blood, dying within 2 or 3 days, passing the disease through the air with every breath. He noted, with the careful precision of a man trying to make sense of something that defied sense, that the second form seemed to spread even faster than the first. Pope Clement VI, on the advice of his physicians, spent much of the epidemic sitting between two large fires, a practice that his doctors believed would purify the air around him. Whether it helped is impossible to say, but he survived. Many of his cardinals did not. The city around him was transformed. By the summer of 1348, Avignon had lost perhaps half its population. The churchyards filled and then overflowed. New burial grounds were consecrated. Then those filled too. Pope Clement issued a papal bull, an official proclamation consecrating the Rhone River itself as holy ground, so that the bodies of the uncountable dead could simply be cast into the water and be considered properly buried. Think about what that tells you. When the river becomes a grave, you have lost count of your dead. Northward. Paris, the greatest city north of the Alps, the seat of the French crown, the home of the University of Paris, which was the most prestigious center of learning in the world, fell to the plague in the spring of 1348. The university's medical faculty was asked by the French king to explain what was causing the catastrophe. They produced a formal document, a concilium, a medical opinion in which they concluded that the primary cause of the plague was an unfavorable conjunction of the planets Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in 1345, which had caused a corruption of the air. Secondary causes, they allowed, included the rotting of unburied corpses, swamps and putrid water, and the southerly winds that blew corrupted air from warmer regions. This was not ignorance, exactly. This was the most sophisticated medical thinking available in 1348, the application of Galenic humoral theory and astrological medicine, which had been the intellectual framework of European medicine for centuries. The problem was not that these doctors were stupid. The problem was that the framework they had inherited was simply not equipped to understand a bacterial infection transmitted by fleas. They were doing the best they could with what they had. Paris lost perhaps 800 people a day at the height of the epidemic. The Hôtel Dieu, the ancient hospital of Paris, run by the Augustinian sisters, was overwhelmed beyond any capacity to function. The nuns continued to care for the sick regardless, and many of them died doing so. Their dedication was noted and remembered and written down. Rest here for a moment. You don't need to carry these numbers. They are just numbers, or they would be, if each one weren't a person, a baker, a child, a nun with her sleeves rolled up, still trying. Let the stillness of where you are hold you. Westward, too, into Iberia. The plague crossed the Pyrenees in the summer of 1348, moving into the kingdoms of Aragon and Castile and Portugal. Spain in the 14th century was a complex mosaic of cultures, Christian kingdoms in the north, the last remnants of Moorish rule in the south, and in the cities of both, large and ancient communities of Jewish people who had lived in Iberia for centuries. The plague would have devastating consequences for those Jewish communities, not because they died more than their neighbors, but because of what their neighbors decided about why they were dying. We will come to that darkness in a later chapter. For now, know only that the plague moved through Iberia with the same terrible efficiency it had shown everywhere else, and that the kings of Spain and Portugal, like every other ruler in Europe, found themselves confronting a catastrophe that no army could fight and no law could stop. And then the sea again, England. The island had watched the reports coming from the continent with a mixture of horror and the particular relief of an island nation. At least the water was between them and it. The Channel, in English minds, has always been a kind of protection, a moat, a mercy. It wasn't enough. In the summer of 1348, a ship docked at the port of Melcombe Regis, a small harbour town on the southern coast of England, in what is now Dorset. The precise date is disputed, but most historians place it around June or July of 1348. One of the sailors on board, or perhaps a flea in the cargo, or perhaps a rat that slipped down the mooring rope, something carried the plague ashore. The chronicler Geoffrey Le Baker wrote that the disease began in Dorset and spread so rapidly that it seemed not to walk but to fly. By autumn it had reached Bristol, one of England's most important ports, a city of maybe 10,000 people. Bristol was decimated. A local chronicler wrote that the living were barely able to bury the dead, and that the grass grew tall in the streets for anyone to walk upon it. By November, it had reached London. London, A city of perhaps 80,000 souls, cramped within its old walls and spreading along the banks of the Thames, was the beating heart of English commerce and governance. When the plague arrived, it did not creep. It roared. The cemeteries at Smithfield and Spitalfields outside the city walls were expanded by emergency command to cope with the dead. A new burial ground was consecrated at East Smithfield. It would later be excavated by archaeologists in the 20th century, its mass graves yielding bones and scientific evidence that would help confirm what the medieval chroniclers had described. The English king, Edward III, postponed a session of Parliament in 1349 because, he wrote, the plague was so severe that it would be dangerous to bring so many people together in one place. It is, in its way, a remarkable document of a medieval king postponing governance because of a public health emergency. Let your thoughts drift downstream. There is no need to hold any of this. The story knows where it is going. Feel the softness around you, the warmth, the quiet. Northward still, through England, into Scotland and Ireland, across the North Sea to the trading ports of the Hanseatic League, Hamburg, Bremen, Lübeck, and from there into Scandinavia, into Denmark and Norway and Sweden. There is a story, perhaps legend, perhaps true, of a ship that drifted into a Norwegian harbor with its entire crew dead. The sailors had all succumbed on the voyage, leaving the vessel to sail on by itself, crewed only by the dead and the rats and the fleas. When the harbor workers boarded the ship to investigate, they found the cargo and they found the silence and they found, though they did not know it yet, the plague. Norway would lose perhaps half its population. Iceland was struck. Even Greenland, at the very edge of the known world, where a small colony of Norse farmers had been living for generations, seems to have been reached, and the settlement there, already fragile, never fully recovered. The Black Death did not stop at any border. It did not respect the Channel, or the Alps, or the North Sea, or the walls of any city. It moved through every gap that human commerce had created, following the roads and rivers and sea lanes that were the veins of medieval civilization. By 1350, just 3 years after those Genoese ships docked in Messina, the plague had touched nearly every corner of Europe. And in its wake, the world was not the same. In hands and the accelerating pace of the entries, the weight of what was happening. How many people died? It is the question everyone asks, and it is the question that is hardest to answer with any certainty. The medieval world did not count itself the way we do. There were no censuses in the modern sense, no national registers of bites and deaths, no statistics offices keeping careful track. What we have instead are fragments, tax records showing the number of households in a village before and after, church records of priests appointed to parishes, revealing how many had died and needed replacing, wills proved in the months of the epidemic, their sudden abundance telling its own story, archaeological evidence from the mass graves that have been excavated across Europe. From all of these fragments, historians have assembled an estimate. In the first wave of the Black Death, roughly 1347 to 1353, Europe lost somewhere between a third and half of its entire population. Some regions lost more. Parts of Italy, France, and England may have lost 60%. Some villages were entirely emptied. Some monasteries, where the monks lived and prayed and ate together in close quarters, lost every single member. The total death toll across Europe is estimated at somewhere between 25 and 50 million people, out of a pre-plague population of perhaps 75 million. These are numbers that resist imagination. They are too large to feel. So let us make them smaller. Let us go to one place and stay there. A village in England. Let us call it what many such villages were called, something ending in ton or wick or ford, a name that has been there since before memory. 150 people, perhaps 200. They know every face. They know whose dog barks in the night, and whose chimney smokes earliest in the morning, and who has been quietly in love with whom for the past 3 years without saying so. The plague arrives in autumn. It arrives the way it always arrives, quietly. At first, a man comes back from market in the nearby town feeling unwell. He is tired, feverish. His wife makes him broth. He sleeps badly, wakes in the night burning. By morning there is a swelling at his neck, hard and hot to the touch, the size of a walnut. By the following morning it is the size of an egg. He is in tremendous pain. The fever is raging. He is dead within a week. His wife falls ill 2 days after he does. His eldest son, 3 days after that. The neighbor who helped carry him to bed. The priest who came to give him last rites, bending close to whisper the words in his ear. This is how it moved through a household, through a street, through a village. Not all at once in waves, in clusters, following the invisible lines of contact and care. The very acts of love and duty that held communities together, tending the sick, sitting with the dying, washing and dressing the dead, became the vectors of transmission. In normal times, the death of a village elder would be an event of great ceremony. The body would be washed and laid out. Neighbors would come to pay their respects. A vigil would be kept through the night. The priest would conduct a proper burial, with prayers and singing and the comfort of ritual. The bereaved would be surrounded by community. In plague time, all of this collapsed. Boccaccio wrote about it in Florence, but the pattern was the same everywhere. People were buried without ceremony, sometimes without a priest, sometimes by strangers hired to do the work because the family was already dead or too sick to stand. Sometimes the bodies lay in houses for days before anyone came, because no one wanted to be the one to go inside. The rituals that human beings had developed over millennia to process grief and mark the passing of lives, those rituals require the living to gather. And gathering, in plague time, was death. Let that quietness settle over you like a blanket. You are here. You are breathing. You are surrounded by a world that, however complicated it might be, is not this. Rest in that. There were those who tried to understand what they were seeing. The symptoms of bubonic plague are distinctive enough that they have been recognized in accounts from the ancient world. There are descriptions in sources as old as the Bible that some scholars believe refer to plague. But the Black Death was, in scale and speed, something that felt entirely new to the people living through it. The swelling of the buboes, which give the disease its name, appeared first in the lymph nodes closest to the site of the flea bite. Groin, armpit, neck. They were excruciatingly painful. The skin over them stretched tight and shiny, turning dark purple, black. The fever was intense, accompanied by headaches and muscle pain and a terrible, overwhelming fatigue. Some patients experienced delirium, confusion, an inability to recognize their own family members. The dark patches on the skin caused by internal bleeding beneath the surface were what gave the epidemic one of its names. Not the Black Death, which is actually a much later term, first appearing in the 16th century and not widely used until the 19th. Contemporary sources called it the pestilence, the great mortality, the great dying. In some languages it was called simply La Moria Grande, the Great Death. The pneumonic form, where the bacteria reached the lungs, was even faster. A person could wake feeling well and be dead by nightfall. They coughed blood. Their breath rattled. They died drowning in their own lungs. And there was a third form, the septicemic plague, where the bacteria entered the bloodstream directly and caused catastrophic immune collapse so fast that people sometimes died before the buboes even had time to form. These were the deaths that seemed to happen for no reason at all, the healthy man who simply fell down in the street. Medieval people had no framework for any of this. They knew nothing of bacteria, nothing of fleas as vectors, nothing of the invisible machinery of infection. What they had was what they had always had: theology, philosophy, and the deep human need to find a reason. If this was happening, then God had permitted it. If God had permitted it, then there was a reason. If there was a reason, then perhaps there was something that could be done. The theological explanation was the most widespread. The plague was God's punishment for human sin. This was not a fringe view or desperate grasping. It was the logical conclusion of the most sophisticated intellectual framework available. The world was God's creation. God was just. Suffering on this scale must therefore be deserved. The appropriate response was repentance, prayer, fasting, and the hope of divine mercy. Pope Clement VI ordered prayers and processions. Church services were held across Europe, vast gatherings of people praying together in cathedrals and churches, which, given what we now know about airborne transmission of the pneumonic form, almost certainly accelerated the spread in exactly the places where people most hoped for salvation. The cruelty of it is almost unbearable, viewed from here. People doing the right thing, the thing their culture told them was right, and dying for it. Feel the weight of your own body, the rise and fall of your chest, the simple, extraordinary fact of being alive and breathing in the dark. Not everyone retreated into prayer. Some retreated into something else entirely. Boccaccio described two types of people in Florence during the plague. Some became devout beyond measure, giving away their possessions, attending every service, trying to outrun death with virtue. And others went the opposite direction entirely. They threw open the taverns. They drank. They sang. They said, openly and without much shame, that if they were going to die anyway, they would die having lived. The houses of the dead were broken into, and their wine cellars emptied. People who had been models of decorum abandoned it completely, because the rules of decorum are built on the assumption that there will be consequences, and when death is everywhere, consequences become very hard to imagine. This is not a judgment. It is a deeply human response to the collapse of the future. When you cannot see past next week becomes everything. Some towns tried to maintain order. Civic authorities issued regulations about the burial of the dead, the movement of people, the operation of markets. Some of these regulations prefigure, in remarkable ways, the public health measures we would recognize today: isolating the sick, restricting movement, closing certain public spaces. In Venice, ships arriving from infected ports were required to anchor offshore and wait for 30 days before their crews could disembark. Later this was extended to 40 days, 40 giorni in Italian, and from those 40 days, we get the word quarantine, which we still use now, nearly 700 years later. A word born in the terror of 1348, still alive in our mouths today. By 1350, in most parts of Europe, the worst of the first wave was passing. Not because the plague had been defeated, it hadn't. It would return again and again throughout the 14th and 15th centuries, smaller outbreaks that kept the population of Europe suppressed for generations. But the great first wave, the catastrophe of 1347 to 1350, had burned through most of its available fuel. The survivors emerged into a changed world. There were empty houses on every street. Fields that had been farmed for generations sat unplanted. Whole craft traditions, the knowledge held in the hands of a master glassblower, a stonemason, a weaver, had died with the people who carried them. Monasteries that had been centers of learning for centuries had lost their libraries, because the monks who could read them were gone. The world was quieter. The world was emptier. And the world was, in ways that would only become clear over the following decades, profoundly altered. But the survivors were still there. They woke in the mornings. They fed their animals. They baked their bread. They looked at one another across the empty spaces where other people used to be, and they went on. Because that is what the living do. When a catastrophe arrives that no one can explain and no one can stop, human beings do not simply wait. They act. They reach for whatever tools their culture has given them: prayer, medicine, superstition, scapegoating, ritual. They try to impose meaning on the meaningless, because meaning is the only armor the mind has. In 1348 and 1349, across Germany and the Low Countries and parts of France, a movement arose that expressed this desperate reaching in one of its most extreme forms: the flagellants. They came in procession, groups of men, sometimes hundreds strong, moving from town to town along the roads. They wore distinctive robes, marked with red crosses. They carried heavy leather whips, knotted and sometimes tipped with iron. And as they walked, and when they arrived in the town squares of the places they visited, they beat themselves. This was not entirely new. Self-mortification, the deliberate infliction of pain on the body as an act of penance, had a long history in Christian practice. What was new in 1348 was the scale, the urgency, and the theology driving it. The flagellants believed, with absolute conviction, that the plague was God's punishment for human sin. They believed, furthermore, that the Church, the institution that was supposed to mediate between humanity and God, had failed. Too many priests were dead. Too many churches were empty. The normal channels of repentance and absolution were blocked or broken. And so they would do it themselves. They would take the punishment of God's anger directly onto their own bodies. They would bleed in public, so that perhaps God's wrath might be satisfied and the dying would stop. The processions were extraordinary spectacles. Crowds gathered to watch them arrive. The flagellants would form a circle in the town square and begin their ritual, prostrating themselves in patterns that represented their particular sins, rising, beating themselves in unison while their leader chanted prayers. The blood was real. The pain was real. And for the watching crowd, themselves terrified, themselves grieving, themselves desperate for something to do, there was something almost hypnotic about it. Some people joined on the spot, abandoning their families and their lives to walk with the procession to the next town. Breathe slowly, in through the nose, out through the mouth. You are watching from a very great distance, from centuries away, from the safety of your own warm dock. The flagellant movement spread rapidly through the German-speaking lands, through the Netherlands, into France. At its peak, it may have involved hundreds of thousands of people across Europe, and it began to frighten the authorities. The flagellants, in their desperation and their conviction, were becoming dangerous. They preached openly that the Church was corrupt and unnecessary, that direct penance, undertaken by ordinary people, was more powerful than any priest's absolution. They began to attract people who had other grievances too: economic resentments, anger at the powerful, the generalized fury of people who have lost too much and need somewhere to put it. Pope Clement VI, the same practical, rational pope sheltering between his fires in Avignon, issued a papal bull in October 1349 condemning the flagellant movement. He ordered the bishops of Europe to suppress it. The flagellants, he argued, were heretics, claiming a direct channel to God that bypassed the Church entirely, performing rituals that had not been sanctioned by Rome. Within a year or two of his condemnation, the movement largely collapsed. Some of its leaders were arrested. The processions thinned and stopped. The roads went quiet again. But the anger that had fed it did not dissipate. It went underground. It simmered. And it would surface again, in different forms, in the century and a half that followed, building, slowly, toward a rupture with the Church that would eventually split Christianity in two. The seeds of the Reformation were many and various, but some of them were planted in the bloody road dust of 1349. Now we must speak of something darker still. When a society is under unbearable pressure, when death is everywhere and no one can explain it, it is very human, and a very terrible tendency to look for someone to blame, to find an outsider, a group that can be identified as different, and to locate in that difference the cause of the catastrophe. In 1348 and 1349, that blame fell on the Jewish communities of Europe. The accusation was specific. Jews, it was said, had poisoned the wells. They had deliberately introduced a plague into Christian communities by contaminating the water supply. This accusation, the blood libel in one of its many forms, had no basis in reality. Jews were dying of the plague in exactly the same proportion as their Christian neighbors. In some places, having slightly different dietary and ritual practices, they may have had marginally different patterns of exposure to infected rats, but not enough to matter. The accusation was a fabrication born of fear and long-standing prejudice. It did not need to be true to be believed. It only needed to be believed. The massacres began in southern France in the spring of 1348 in the town of Toulon. They spread rapidly. In Basel, the Jewish community was herded into a wooden building and burned alive. In Strasbourg, several hundred Jewish people were killed. In Mainz, the Jewish community defending itself killed 200 of the attackers before being overwhelmed and massacred in turn. In Cologne, in Frankfurt, in Nuremberg, in town after town across the German-speaking lands, the pattern repeated. In some places, Jewish communities were expelled before they could be killed, driven out of the cities where they had lived for generations, their property confiscated, their synagogues destroyed. Pope Clement VI, to his credit, intervened. He issued 2 papal bulls in 1348 pointing out clearly and correctly that Jewish people were dying of the plague too, and that the accusation of well poisoning was therefore logically incoherent. He ordered the persecution to stop. It did not stop. The local bishops and the town councils and the mobs in the streets were beyond the reach of papal authority in those desperate months. The killings continued until the first wave of the plague had passed and the immediate terror had subsided, and then, slowly, they stopped. Not because anyone had been held accountable. Not because the accusation had been disproved to anyone's satisfaction. But because the moment of absolute panic had passed, and ordinary human inertia reasserted itself. The Jewish communities of Europe, already confined to specific neighborhoods, already legally restricted in countless ways, already carrying the weight of centuries of organized hostility, had been devastated. Some communities never recovered. The geography of Jewish life in Europe was permanently altered by the pogroms of 1348 and 1349. I want to stay here for a moment, not to dwell in the darkness of it, but to acknowledge it honestly. Because the story of the Black Death is not only a story of a bacterium and a flea and a tragic misunderstanding of medicine. It is also a story about what human communities do to each other under pressure, about how fear can be redirected, weaponized, turned against the innocent. That pattern did not begin in 1348, and it did not end there. But acknowledging it, clearly and without looking away, is part of what it means to take history seriously. Let your breath be steady. Let the weight of this settle, and then let it be carried away by the rain. You have the moral clarity to feel the wrongness of what happened from here across all those centuries. That clarity is worth something. It is not nothing. Rest in it. And now, finally, the Church itself. The institution that had been the backbone of European civilization for nearly 1,000 years, the organization that ran the hospitals, copied the manuscripts, educated the educated, and told people what their lives meant. The Church emerged from the Black Death profoundly damaged. The reasons were several. First, the dead. Priests died in enormous numbers, partly because their vocation required them to be present at the bedsides of the dying, to administer last rites, to stand in the place where infection was most concentrated. Some priests fled, as Boccaccio noted with contempt. But many stayed and died for it, and the dioceses of Europe found themselves desperately short of clergy. The response was to ordain replacements too quickly. Men who had not completed the full course of education, men of questionable character, men who simply happened to be available were ordained as priests to fill the empty parishes. The quality of the clergy, already a source of complaint before the plague, declined further. Second, the failure of explanation. The Church had told people that God was in control, that the world made sense, that suffering had meaning. The Black Death made it very hard to feel the truth of any of that. It was not that people stopped believing, most of them didn't. But a seed of doubt was planted that the Church's answers were not, in the end, sufficient. That the world could be more cruel and more arbitrary than theology had accounted for. Third, the sheer cost. Monasteries emptied. Libraries went unread. The long, slow project of preserving and transmitting knowledge, which the Church had been conducting with extraordinary dedication for centuries, was interrupted. Some of what was lost was never recovered. The Church would not fall for another century and a half. But the cracks that opened in 1348 and 1349 were real, and they ran deep, and time would widen them. Let us begin with a room. A room in a physician's house in 14th century Europe. It is small and warm, its shelves lined with ceramic jars and glass vessels, with bundles of dried herbs hanging from the beams, with manuscripts in Latin stacked carefully on a wooden desk. The smell is complex dried lavender, something astringent, wood smoke, old leather. The physician who works here has spent perhaps 10 years in formal education. He has studied at a university Bologna, perhaps, or Montpellier, or Paris, reading Hippocrates and Galen and Avicenna, the great Islamic physician whose Encyclopedia of Medicine was the most comprehensive medical text in the world. He can read Latin and probably Arabic in translation. He understands the theory of the four humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, and believes, as all educated men of his age believe, that health is a matter of balance between them. He is not a fool. He is, by the standards of his time, one of the most educated people alive. And he is completely unprepared for what is coming through his door. Let your breathing slow, in and out. Feel the warmth of the imagined fire, the quiet of the imagined room. The physicians of the 14th century understood disease through the lens of miasma theory, the idea that illness was caused by corrupted or poisoned air, bad air rising from swamps, from rotting organic matter, from the unburied dead. This theory was ancient, inherited from the Greeks, and it was not entirely wrong in the sense that many genuinely dangerous things do arise in proximity to decay and filth. It simply missed the actual mechanism entirely. When the plague arrived, the miasma theory shaped every response. If the disease came from corrupted air, then the answer was to purify the air. Physicians recommended burning aromatic woods, juniper, ash, fig in the streets and in the homes of the sick. They recommended carrying posies of fragrant flowers and herbs, roses, lavender, rue, and holding them to the nose when passing through infected areas. They recommended avoiding low-lying ground in south-facing locations where bad air might pool. They recommended fleeing to high ground, to places with clean breezes. Some of this, accidentally, may have helped not by purifying the air, but by moving people away from the concentrations of infected rats and fleas that tended to cluster in low, damp, warmly inhabited spaces. The dietary recommendations make for interesting reading. Physicians advised against eating fish caught from rivers that ran through infected areas, against fruit that had fallen to the ground, against legumes and foods that caused flatulence. They advised eating lightly, moderately. Some advised drinking good wine not to excess, but as a tonic for the constitution. In a world without germ theory, This was not entirely unreasonable advice. The treatments for those who had already fallen ill were another matter. The buboes, those agonizing swellings in the groin and armpit and neck, presented physicians with a direct, visible target, and they focused on it with everything they had. The standard approach was to try to bring the bubo to a head, to encourage it to swell and eventually burst, in the belief that the poison was being drawn out of the body. Physicians applied poultices of butter and onion and garlic to the swellings. They applied heated glass cups to draw the contents upward. More aggressively, some practitioners lanced the buboes with knives or cauterized them with hot irons. This last practice is particularly interesting from a modern perspective. Lancing and draining the buboes almost certainly did help some patients. Not because it removed the bacteria, the infection was systemic by then, in the bloodstream, but because it may have reduced the load of bacteria concentrated in the lymph node, given the immune system a slightly better chance. Some patients who survived recorded that the lancing of the bubo was the turning point of their illness. Guy de Chauliac, the Pope's physician in Avignon, whom we met in an earlier chapter, was a most accomplished surgeon of his age. He wrote carefully about his own experience of the plague, noting that he contracted it and survived it, and crediting his survival partly to the lancing of his own bubo. He was unusual among physicians in insisting on staying at his post rather than fleeing, which he considered a moral obligation. He wrote, with remarkable clarity, "I was afraid to die, but I was not willing to abandon my patients." That sentence, written in 1349, deserves to stand on its own for a moment. I was afraid to die, but I was not willing to abandon my patients. Rest in that for a moment. In the middle of everything, the panic, the mass graves, the flagellants on the road, the empty churches, there was a man sitting by the bed of someone dying, not because he could save them, but because he had decided that presence was its own form of medicine. He was right. There were others like him. The Augustinian nuns of the Hôtel Dieu in Paris, whom we mentioned briefly before they stayed at their posts throughout the epidemic, nursing the sick in conditions of almost unimaginable difficulty, the wards overflowing, the bodies of the dead stacked in corridors while the living was still being carried in. Contemporary accounts note that the nuns died in great numbers and were replaced by new nuns who then also died. The institution kept functioning because there were always more women willing to take the place of those who had fallen. Their motivation was religious. They believed they were serving Christ in the bodies of the poor and the sick. But the effect, whatever the motivation, was that people who would otherwise have died alone and untended were cared for, were washed, were given water, were spoken to. This matters more than it might seem. Not because the nursing changed the clinical outcome, in most cases it didn't, but because being accompanied, being seen, being tended to at the end, these things matter to human beings in ways that have nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with dignity. There were also those who tried to understand the disease at a deeper level than current theory allowed. Some physicians, noticing that the plague seemed to spread from person to person even when there was no obvious source of corrupted air, began to articulate something like the idea of contagion, the notion that the disease was somehow carried between people by direct contact or close proximity. This was a radical departure from miasma theory, and most of the medical establishment resisted it. But a few thinkers pressed on. The Italian physician Girolamo Fracaturo would, in the following century, develop a formal theory of contagion that came remarkably close to the germ theory that Louis Pasteur would finally prove in the 19th century. The seeds of that understanding were planted in the bewilderment of 1348. Some physicians noticed that certain people seemed immune or at least much more resistant than others. They saw people who had nursed multiple dying patients and never fell ill themselves. They saw families where one member survived while everyone else died. They had no framework to understand what we now know, that individual immune responses vary, that some genetic factors confer partial resistance to Yersinia pestis, that the pneumonic and bubonic forms have different mechanisms of transmission, but they noticed the pattern, and they recorded it, and those records matter. There is something almost unbearably poignant about the medical literature of the plague years. These were intelligent, dedicated, careful people, working within the best intellectual framework they had, trying to make sense of something that their framework was simply not built to explain. They wrote treatises and consulted with each other and debated causes and tried treatment after treatment. They failed, by and large, to cure anyone. They almost certainly failed to prevent the spread of the disease. Some of their interventions, the communal prayer services, the gathering of people in churches, almost certainly made things worse. And yet they kept writing. They kept observing. They kept recording what they saw, honestly and in detail, because they believed correctly that the record itself might be useful. That someone, someday, reading their careful descriptions, might understand something they could not. And eventually, someone did. The descriptions written by medieval physicians in 1348 and 1349 were among the documents that helped 19th-century scientists identify and understand Yersinia pestis when it appeared again in Hong Kong in 1894. The chain of observation runs unbroken from the candlelit room in 14th-century Avignon to the modern laboratory. Let that land softly. The work they did, imperfect, frightened, carried out in the dark of a catastrophe they couldn't understand, was not wasted. It moved forward, as all careful observation does, into hands that could use it. Nothing is wasted. Not the notes made by frightened physicians. Not the death registers kept by men who knew they might be next. Not the careful, grieving records of people trying to make sense of the senseless. It all moved forward. Listen. Do you hear it? The quiet. Not the quiet of a room late at night, with its small familiar sounds, the house settling, the distant hum of the world outside. A different kind of quiet. Older. Wider. The quiet of an empty field where a village used to be. Let yourself sink into it. There is nothing you need to do. Nowhere you need to go. Just this: the grass and the wind and the open sky, and the long, long stillness. Around 1350, the first great wave of the Black Death began to recede. It did not end cleanly. It did not announce itself or send a signal. It simply began to thin. Fewer cases here, a week passing without a new death there, a gradual, uneven retreat that took months to be sure of. People were cautious about believing it was over. They had been through too much. The world had broken its promises too many times. But slowly, the dying slowed. And then it stopped. And the survivors stood in the silence and looked at what remained. What remained was a world that looked almost like the one they had known: the same fields, the same roads, the same church towers rising above the same village rooflines, but emptied, quieted, as if someone had turned the sound down on everything. In England, surveys conducted in the years after the plague recorded village after village in which the number of occupied households had been cut by half or more. In some parishes, the priest recorded no baptisms for a year, 2 years, 3. Not because people had stopped having children, they had not, but because there were so few people left that even the ordinary events of life came rarely. Across Europe, tens of millions of acres of farmland went unplowed. Think about what that means. Land that had been cleared from forest by the labor of generations, land that had been broken and turned and planted and harvested every year within living memory, and the living memory before that was simply left. The plows stopped. The oxen were gone, or their owners were gone, or both. And the land did what land always does when human beings stop attending to it. It went back. Let your breathing match it. Slow and easy. The sound of a world returning to itself. First the weeds came back into the fields. Then the scrub, the hawthorn and elder and bramble that are always waiting at the edge of any cleared land, patient as water, ready to move in the moment attention lapses. Within a generation, fields that had grown wheat and rye for 200 years were thick with young trees. Forests grew where villages had been. There is something in this that is not only sad. There is something in it that is also, at a very long remove, quietly beautiful. The land did not mourn. The land did not know what it had lost. It simply resumed its older patterns, the ones that existed before the axes came, before the plows, before the first human hands reached into the soil of that particular place and decided to make something of it. The deer moved back into places where they had not been for a century. The beaver returned to rivers where they had been trapped out of existence. Wildflowers colonized the old field margins. The air over the empty farmland was loud with bird skylarks rising from the long grass, kestrels hanging over the meadows that used to be barley fields. The silence was not only grief. It was also wildness, returning. In the towns and cities, the silence was different. Walk, in your imagination, through a city in 1351. Let it be a city you know from our earlier chapters, Florence, perhaps, or London. You know its shape now, the narrow streets, the overhanging upper stories of the timber buildings almost touching overhead, the market square with its stalls and its noise and its smell. But the noise is gone. There are people in the city that are not empty. Perhaps half the people who lived here 3 years ago are still here. But half of what was present before is absent now, and absence has its own texture, its own presence. You notice it in the spaces. The houses whose shutters have been closed for 2 years now. The workshop whose door stands open onto a room where the tools are still laid out on the bench, exactly as they were left the morning their owner went to bed and never got up again. The market square is quieter. Not silent, there are voices, there are transactions, there is the ordinary business of the living going on. But there are fewer stalls, fewer buyers, fewer arguments. The city has not forgotten how to be a city. It is simply a smaller one than it was. And in the smaller city, some things are strange. Property has moved. The houses of the dead, in the complicated legal aftermath of the plague, have passed to heirs who sometimes did not expect to be heirs, younger children, distant cousins, people who find themselves, suddenly and without preparation, in possession of more than they ever imagined. Wealth has redistributed itself in ways that no one planned and no system anticipated. Land is available. Labor is scarce. That second fact is the scarcity of labor will matter enormously. It is already, even in 1351, beginning to matter. Let your thoughts drift. There is no hurry. The story is patient. Feel the darkness behind your closed eyes. The warmth around you. Rest here in the silence of 1351. The monasteries. Walk, in your imagination, into a Benedictine monastery somewhere in England or France. A great house of stone, built over generations, its church soaring above the cloister, its library accumulated over 3 centuries of careful copying and collection. In 1346, this monastery had perhaps 60 monks. Now it has 17. The 17 who remain are trying to keep everything going. They observe the canonical hours. The bells still ring. The prayers are still said. The rhythm of the monastic day continues, because the rhythm is what gives life its meaning and they will not let go of it. But everything takes longer now. Chores that were divided among 60 pairs of hands must be divided among 17. The infirmary is understaffed. The scriptorium is nearly empty. There are not enough monks literate enough to continue the copying work, and the manuscripts that were in progress sit on their desks, unfinished, their last lines trailing off in mid-sentence. In the library, the books accumulate dust. Some of those books are unique. There is no other copy anywhere in the world of certain texts on the shelves of certain monastic libraries, texts copied from texts that go back, in some cases, to the ancient world. When the monks who can read them are gone, those texts are in danger. Some were lost. Some were lost in the plague years and in the difficult decades that followed, when the monasteries struggled to maintain their numbers and their standards. The thinning of the learned class, the people who could read Latin, who understood the classical tradition, who were custodians of the accumulated knowledge of the Western world, was one of the less visible but deeply consequential losses of the Black Death. But here is the thing about books and knowledge and the human impulse to record and preserve. It does not die easily. Even in the worst of the plague years, people were writing. Boccaccio, in Florence, was writing the Decameron, framing the whole terrible experience as a series of stories told by young people who had retreated to a villa outside the city to escape the plague. 10 people, 10 days, 100 stories. Full of life and wit and desire and mischief. The whole collection is animated by a defiant insistence that beauty and pleasure and human connection are worth something, even especially in the shadow of death. It is one of the greatest works of European literature. It was written in the middle of a catastrophe. Giovanni Villani, the Florentine chronicler, had been writing a history of Florence for decades. He was still writing it when the plague arrived. His chronicle breaks off mid-sentence, in 1348. He died before he could finish it. His nephew Matteo picked up the pen and continued. That is the thing. Someone always picks up the pen. Let that settle over you like something warm. Someone always picks up the pen. The Venetian clerk whose handwriting changes in the death register. The nephew who continues the chronicle. The physician who writes down what he sees even though he cannot explain it. The nun who goes back into the ward even though everyone around her is dying. Someone always picks up the pen. The silence of 1350 and 1351 was not permanent. It could not be. Human beings do not remain in stillness for long. It is not in the nature of the species. The silence was a kind of breathing space. A pause. The long exhale after an enormous shock, before the body remembers that it has things to do. And slowly, unevenly, with setbacks and recurrences, with the knowledge that the plague would return, as it did, again and again throughout the second half of the 14th century, slowly, the world began to move. Farms were replanted. Roads were repaired. Markets reopened. Marriages were made. Children were born. Apprentices were taken on and taught the trades their masters had died knowing. In the cities, the empty houses were reoccupied. The workshops reopened. The bells rang again at the canonical hours. The world that emerged was not the same as the world before. We will talk about that in the next 2 chapters. About the disruptions to the old order, the labor shortages that gave ordinary working people a power they had never had before, the uprisings that followed, the political earthquakes. About the art that arose from the grief, the extraordinary flowering of the late medieval imagination, obsessed with death in ways that produced some of the most beautiful and haunting images in the history of European art. The single most disruptive consequence of the Black Death, more disruptive, in its way, than even the immediate death toll, was economic. It sounds cold to say it that way, but economics, at its root, is just the story of how people organize their labor and their resources. And the plague had done something to labor that no king or lord or parliament had ever done, or could have done. It had made working people scarce. Before the plague, Europe was, in many regions, overpopulated relative to the amount of productive land available. The feudal system depended, in large part, on this surplus of labor. Lords owned the land. Peasants worked it in exchange for the right to farm small plots of their own. Because there were always more peasants than there was available land, the terms of this arrangement heavily favored the lords. A peasant who didn't like his conditions had nowhere to go. There were 10 others ready to take his place. After the plague, this calculus inverted. The lords still owned the land, but there were not enough people to work it. Fields that needed plowing went unplowed not because no one wanted food, but because there was no one left to swing the plow. Harvests rotted in fields because the labor to bring them in was simply not there, and the peasants who survived knew it. Let your body be heavy. Let the warmth hold you. Across England and France and the German-speaking lands, in the years and decades after the plague, working people began to demand better terms. Not in any organized or coordinated way, at first just individually, quietly, at the level of a single man walking to the next village and offering his labor to a different lord for better pay. A woman negotiating the terms of her service more firmly than her mother could have. A craftsman raising his prices because he could, because there were fewer craftsmen and more people who needed what they made. The lords did not accept this gracefully. In England, the response was the Statute of Labourers, passed in 1351, a law that attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, to compel workers to accept the old terms, to punish those who left their home villages in search of better conditions. In France, similar measures were enacted. The ruling classes looked at the new economic reality and tried, by legal force, to make it go back to the old one. It didn't work. You cannot legislate away a labor shortage. The economic pressure was too great, the incentives too powerful, the workers too aware of their own new leverage. Enforcement was patchy and often impossible. Lords who strictly enforced the old terms found their workers drifting away to lords who quietly didn't. The law existed and was largely ignored, and the wages crept upward anyway. But the attempt to enforce it, the visible, daily reminder that the powerful were trying to use the law to keep the powerless in their place, stored up a pressure that eventually released itself in fire. In the summer of 1381, in England, it released. The peasants' revolt, sometimes called Wat Tyler's Rebellion after one of its leaders, was the largest popular uprising in English history to that point. It was triggered specifically by a poll tax, a flat tax levied per head, regardless of wealth, which fell most heavily on those least able to pay. But it drew on a generation of accumulated grievance that went back directly to the plague years and the attempts to suppress the new economic expectations that had arisen from them. The rebels marched on London. They were not a rabble. They had leaders. They had demands. They had a coherent political program. They wanted the abolition of serfdom, fair wages, the right to rent land at fixed rates. They wanted, in essence, the world that the economics of the post-plague era had already half-created to be formally recognized and protected by law. They briefly held London. They met with the young king, Richard II, who made promises. And then, in the way of such things, the promises were broken, the leaders were executed, and the revolt was suppressed. But serfdom in England did not recover. It limped on for a few more generations and then, by the middle of the 15th century, had effectively ceased to exist. Not because any law abolished it, but because the economic conditions that had made it functional were gone and could not be restored. The plague had made it obsolete, and no amount of political suppression could bring back the world in which it made sense. In France, the Jacquerie of 1358, a peasant uprising named with contempt by the nobles who suppressed it, after a generic name for a peasant, Jacques had followed a similar trajectory and a similar outcome. Violence, suppression, apparent defeat. And then, slowly, the same long drift toward better conditions, because the economics demanded it. These are not comfortable stories. They are stories of people being killed for wanting what the world had accidentally, catastrophically taught them to expect. But they are also stories of a world changing despite the attempts of the powerful to stop it. Of the plague's disruption working its way through the social structure like water through limestone slowly, irresistibly, finding every crack. Rest a little more deeply. The story is moving toward its ending. Let your breath slow. And now let us talk about art. Because the people who lived through the Black Death and its aftermath did not only farm and revolt and negotiate wages. They also made things. And the things they made, in the second half of the 14th century and into the 15th, are among the most extraordinary and haunting objects in the history of European art. They were obsessed with death. This is not surprising. They had reason to be. But the obsession took a particular form, not despair exactly, but a kind of fierce, clear-eyed confrontation with mortality that produced images of extraordinary power. The most famous of these is the Danse Macabre, the Dance of Death. It appeared first as a painted mural. In churches and charnel houses across Europe, long processions painted on the walls, in which skeletal figures of death led living people in a dance they cannot escape. Pope and peasant, king and merchant, bishop and beggar, death takes them all, in equal measure, regardless of rank or wealth or virtue. A pope in his tiara is led by the hand, by the same grinning skeleton that leads the beggar at the end of the line. The message was theological memento mori. Remember that you will die, but the equality of it had a subversive edge. Death, the mural said, does not respect hierarchy. The lord is no more exempt than the serf. The bishop is no safer than the tanner. The plague, which truly had killed without reference to rank, had made this lesson viscerally real, and the art absorbed it. These images spread across Europe. They appeared in manuscripts, in woodcuts, eventually in the new medium of print. Versions of the Danse Macabre were painted in churches from Spain to Sweden, from England to the Baltic. Everywhere the plague had gone, the dance followed. It is somber imagery, seen from the outside. But there is something in it that is also strange, as this sounds almost companionable. Death is everywhere. Yes. Death is coming for all of us. Yes. But it is coming for all of us equally, which is a kind of justice. And there is something almost festive about the image of the dance, something that refuses pure despair, that insists on movement, on rhythm, on the idea that even the march toward death has a form, has a shape, is something that can be witnessed and depicted and, in depicting, somehow managed. The poetry of the period carries the same quality. William Langland wrote Piers Plowman in England in the decades after the plague, a long, strange, visionary poem about a society trying to understand itself after catastrophe, asking hard questions about justice and labor and the obligations of the powerful to the poor. Geoffrey Chaucer was writing the Canterbury Tales in the same era, that great comic, humane, boisterous collection of stories told by pilgrims on the road to Canterbury, full of life and laughter, and the irrepressible human impulse to tell stories, to entertain, to make the world make sense through narrative. Both of these writers were shaped by the plague world. Both of them wrote into the silence it left behind. Both of them produced works that are still read, still alive, still doing what literature does, making the past present, making the strange familiar, reminding us across 7 centuries that the people who lived then were people, fully and completely, in all the ways we are. Let the stars come out. Feel the dark deepen around you into something soft and full rather than empty. Europe at the close of the 14th century was a different place than Europe at its beginning. Smaller in population, quieter in places, still marked by the physical traces of the catastrophe, the empty villages, the fields grown over, the churches with their dense macabre murals darkening on the walls. But also, and this is the thing that history keeps insisting on, the thing that makes this story worth telling, also alive, also moving, also full of people planting fields and raising children and arguing in taverns and writing poems and painting pictures and demanding better wages and making plans for next spring. The world had been broken open, and into the break, like wildflowers into a cracked wall, something new was beginning to grow. The Renaissance did not begin because of the Black Death. It is important to say that clearly. The intellectual and artistic movement that flowered in Italy in the late 14th and 15th centuries had roots that went deeper than the plague, roots in the rediscovery of classical texts, in the wealth of the Italian city-states, in the particular character of Italian humanism that had been developing for generations before 1347. But the plague shaped it, accelerated it, broke open the ground in which it grew. Here is how. When a third of the population of Europe dies within the space of 3 years, and when the institution that has been the primary custodian of meaning, the Church, is visibly damaged by its failure to explain or prevent the catastrophe, something shifts in how people think about the world and their place in it. Before the plague, the dominant intellectual mode in Europe was oriented upward and inward. Upward, toward God, the source of all truth and meaning. Inward, toward Scripture and the established commentaries on Scripture, the great accumulated edifice of theological argument that had been built over 1,000 years. The purpose of human life, in this framework, was to prepare the soul for what came after it. The things of this world, the body, the senses, beauty, pleasure, and individual achievement were subordinate to that preparation, sometimes dangerously distracting from it. After the plague, something in this orientation shifted. Not suddenly, not completely. The Church remained enormously powerful for another century and beyond, and most people remained genuinely devout by any standard we would recognize. But the balance moved. The question that the plague had driven into the heart of every survivor, what is a human life worth, began to receive different answers. Let your breathing be slow and easy. The story is carrying you home. The thinkers and artists of the Italian Renaissance began to answer that question differently. A human life, they said, is worth the living of it. The things of this world, beauty, learning, friendship, the exercise of the mind and the senses, are not distractions from something more important. They are the thing itself. They are the point. This is humanism. Not humanism in the weakened sense the word sometimes carries now, but humanism in its original, startling, radical sense. The conviction that human beings, in their full particularity, with their bodies and their minds and their passions and their flaws, are worth paying attention to, worth depicting, worth understanding, worth celebrating. Look at what was made. Petrarch, who lived through the plague and lost to it a woman he had loved for years, a woman named Laura, whose death he mourned in poetry of extraordinary beauty. Petrarch began in the decades before and after the plague to develop a new relationship with the classical world, not as a source of theological support, but as a conversation. The writers and thinkers of ancient Rome and Greece were, for Petrarch, not pagan precursors to Christianity, but human beings like himself, curious, passionate, afraid of death, capable of wisdom. He wrote to Cicero as if writing to a friend. This is a small thing that is also an enormous thing. The idea that across 15 centuries, a man could reach back and recognize himself in another man, that the human experience had a continuity that transcended theology, transcended empire, transcended all the catastrophes history could produce. This idea would change everything. In Florence, in the decades after the plague, the money that had survived the catastrophe began to flow toward art. The great banking families diminished, but still wealthy. Their populations reduced, but their relative wealth, in some cases, increased by inheritance from the dead, began to commission paintings and sculptures with a new sensibility. Faces that looked like actual faces. Bodies that moved with the weight and grace of actual bodies. Expressions of grief and joy and longing that had not been permitted in the flatter, more stylized art of the generations before. Giotto had begun this revolution before the plague. His faces were already moving toward the human, already reaching for psychological truth. But it was in the post-plague decades that the revolution consolidated and accelerated. Artists studying the classical statues that had survived from the ancient world. Dissecting bodies to understand how muscles moved beneath skin. Looking at the world with new eyes, eyes that had seen so much death that they had developed a ferocious hunger for the living. This is speculative, in the way that all historical psychology is speculative. We cannot know what it felt like to be a painter in Florence in 1380, to have grown up surrounded by the absence of the dead. But the art suggests something. The art suggests people looking very, very hard at what was still there, making it permanent in color and stone, insisting on it. Rest here, in the slowly lightening dark. Filippo Brunelleschi solved the problem of the dome. The Cathedral of Florence Santa Maria del Fiore had been under construction for generations when the plague arrived. It was a cathedral of extraordinary ambition, its nave and transept already built, but with a gap at the crossing where a dome was planned, a dome so large that no one in Europe knew how to build it. The mathematics of how to span that width, at that height, without the dome collapsing under its own weight, had defeated every architect who had considered it. Brunelleschi, working in the decades after the plague, in the first years of the 15th century, solved it. His solution was elegant and unprecedented, a double-shell dome, with an internal herringbone brickwork structure that distributed the stresses in a way that had never been done before. It rose above Florence for the first time in 1436, and it still rises there now. It is the first great engineering achievement of the Renaissance. It changed the history of architecture. And it was built in a city that had lost half its people to the plague less than a century before. The dome did not arise in spite of the catastrophe. It arose in a city that had been cracked open, that had lost its certainties, that had been forced to look at the world fresh. A city where the old answers had failed and new ones were needed. A city where the question, what is a human being capable of, had been asked by the worst possible circumstances and had, slowly, defiantly, begun to receive the most extraordinary answers. Tenberg's printing press arrived in the 1440s and 1450s, roughly a century after the plague. It was not caused by the plague. But consider what it found when it arrived, a Europe that had been reminded, at terrible cost, of the fragility of knowledge. A Europe where the loss of the learned class had shown, viscerally, what happened when books could only be preserved in the hands of a few. A Europe that had watched manuscripts go unread in empty monasteries, had watched knowledge hover on the edge of extinction, had watched the single copies of irreplaceable texts gather dust when the monks who could read them were gone. The printing press arrived into a world that understood, in its bones, why it mattered. The eagerness with which Europe embraced the technology, the speed with which it spread, the hunger with which people reached for the books it produced was the hunger of a civilization that had been frightened, that knew what loss looked like, that would not be caught that way again. Within 50 years of Gutenberg, there were printing presses in every major city in Europe. Within 100 years, millions of books were in circulation. The knowledge that had nearly been extinguished was not merely preserved, it was multiplied beyond any possibility of extinction. Let your eyes stay closed. Let the light be something felt rather than seen. We began this story in a world of mud and smoke and bells. A world that was hard and beautiful and entirely unaware of what was coming toward it. We have walked through the catastrophe together, through the harbors and the plague pits, through the desperate prayers and the terrible violence, through the silence of the emptied world. And now we are here, at the far end of it, standing in a city where a dome rises above the rooftops that was not there before, where books are multiplying faster than fire can destroy them, where painters are looking at human faces with a new ferocity of attention, where working people are beginning, slowly and at great cost, to negotiate the terms of their own lives. The world that came out of the Black Death was not better, in any simple sense, than the world that went in. Too much was lost. The dead was simply dead. The farmer in his field, the child in the shed bed, the nun with her sleeves rolled up. No flowering of the Renaissance replaces them. No cathedral dome accounts for them. But the world that came out of it was alive, was moving, was reaching for things it had not reached for before. And that world, the world of the printing press and the dome and the human face in paint, became, over the following centuries, the world that produced the science that eventually identified Yersinia pestis, that developed the understanding of contagion, that made quarantine modern superstition, that built the public health systems that mean a bacterial infection that once killed half a continent can now be treated with a course of antibiotics. The chain runs forward. The work of the frightened physicians, the death registers kept by the dying clocks, the careful observations of the survivors, all of it moved forward, link by link, into hands that could use it. The dead were the price. The living were the continuance. And you are here, in the warm dark, at the end of a long story, in a world built on the far side of that catastrophe. The people of 1347 could not have imagined you. Could not have imagined the room you are in, the warmth around you, the extraordinary safety and comfort of your ordinary night. The things that protect you, the medicine, the infrastructure, the knowledge embedded in every system around you were built, brick by careful brick, by the civilization that the Black Death cracked open and could not destroy. You are what the survivors were working toward. Not only you, everyone, all of us. But you are part of it. That is a good thing to fall asleep knowing. Let the bird's single note be enough. Let the first light be just the first light. Let the old world rest. And let yourself rest with it, warm and safe and at the far end of a very long road. The story is done. Sleep well. This concludes the video. Thanks for watching. Sleep well. Good night.